I can't help it. Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Thank you so much for joining me here on this particular live. Happy Friday, happy weekend, happy whatever day it is for you when you're watching this. Let us get right to it. Do you think we can be under half an hour today? Probably not. But we're gonna sure try. If you are here live, please say hi. Say hi in the comments. I can see them today, so I will say hi back. Of course, if you have any questions throughout the live, please let me know and I will do my very best to answer them. If not, and you're catching the replay, just as good, leave me a comment or a question below and I will answer them for you. So, last week, just to recap, we talked all about shame and we're going on this kind of journey into different emotions or feelings. And we started last week with shame. And as I explained, we're looking at this from an energetic output standpoint, meaning that we have all kinds of them, ranging from shame to inner peace. Shame being a level 20 on an energetic output, meaning the vibration is very kind of low vibration. They're like this, very slow, all the way up to peace, which is high vibration at an energetic output of 1,000, which is very high vibrational, very positive. It will literally emanate from your whole body. People will start coming up to you and being like, what's your secret and all that good stuff. But today we're moving up the scale because I want us to go from shame to the next one, which is guilt, to the next one, and move all the way up. Believe you me, we're not doing 1,000 of them. Although I could do 1,000 of them, but I mean, who wants that? We're going to switch things up a bit. But today we're exploring guilt, which is a really great topic. I'm actually really excited to talk about this because I think it's something we can all relate to. Everyone has experienced guilt in one form of another at some point in their life. So I think it's a good thing to kind of break down and understand a little bit better. As far as an energetic output, is concerned, shame, as we remember, was 20. We're transcending, we're moving on up, moving on up. I'm in a mood today, so you're gonna have to bear with me. Guilt is at a level 30, so you can see we're moving from one to the next. So while still on the lower vibrational side, guilt is one step up. So we're getting there. We're moving up. We're going up the scale, and it's just one step to the other. So I'm gonna pull out my notes, and we're gonna get on to it. I'm going to try not to sing through this whole thing, but if I do, I mean, you're going to like it, right? That's just who I am as a person. So, okay, let's move along. So I wanted to create this live. As I said, we're kind of going on this journey, but I want you to understand why you're here. So if you have been harboring and hanging on to things from the past, if you kind of are overthinking them and you're doing the shoulda, woulda, coulda, and oh, I wish I didn't say that, and oh man, I shouldn't have done that to this person, this is something that you're going to want to stay tuned for and you're going to get a lot out of, because I want to show you how to mitigate some of those feelings and how to move through them so you can release the guilt, release the shame associated with it, and move up the ladder, right? We want to ultimately get to self-forgiveness. That's what we're all here for, right? We want to forgive our perceived sins of the past or wrongdoing and move along, right? So why else might you be here, you might ask? If you find yourself consistently thinking about these situations, like if they are consistently coming in your brain, if you're waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're having those moments of like, oh my God, why did I do that? This is something I'm hoping you'll get a lot out of. And maybe, you're really trying hard to bury the emotions that are associated with these guilty feelings, and they keep coming into your mind over and over and over again, like some repeat song, but the song is one that you don't really like. It's like a song that you hate and you have to keep listening to it over and over again. It's like that. Guilt can come up that way in waves where it'll just hit you when you're least expecting it, and it continues, and the more you try to repress it, the more it's just festering, and it's still there no matter what. Even if you try and push it into the subconscious, it's still, those feelings of guilt are still going to be there, right? So if you're consistently worried about people, that they might find you out, we talked about this last week about imposter syndrome, right? If you're feeling guilty about something, even if it's something you haven't even done, if it's like a thought, if it's like something you had come into your mind and you're having guilt even about the thought itself, and you're consistently feeling like people are going to figure out what you might feel guilty about, let's go through it. Let's bring it back. Let's strip it down. Let's work through it together. And if you view yourself, or you have viewed yourself for a really long time as the root cause of somebody else's suffering, I don't want you to hang on to those feelings anymore. I don't want you to hang on to that baggage anymore. I want you to be able to put the bag down and say, it's okay. You are here. I've held on to you, but I'm processing it and I'm moving forward. And if you're tired of carrying that weight around, if you're tired of carrying the weight of guilt around everywhere you go, this is especially for you. So before we can move on to exploring guilt, we have to define it, as always, right? So the American Psychological Association says that guilt is a self-conscious emotion characterized by a painful appraisal of having done or thought something that is wrong, and often by a readiness to act designed to undo or mitigate this wrong. It's weird how they wrote this, but I literally took it word for word. It is distinct from shame, in which there is an additional strong fear of one's deeds being publicly exposed to judgment or ridicule. And I'm going to get into, during this live, the difference between shame and guilt, because I think a lot of people think that they're very similar or interchangeable, but there is a distinct difference. Very Well Mind defines guilt as a self-conscious emotion that involves negative evaluations of the self, feelings of distress, and feelings of failure. So some of the symptoms of guilt, if you're asking yourself, like, is what I'm feeling guilt? Is this what I'm feeling? You might have anxiety. There might be emotions such as crying or anger. You might have insomnia, muscle tension, preoccupation with the past. That's a big one. Regret or worry. And as I said, you might be thinking, hey, does this sound an awful lot like shame, which you talked about last week, Denise? How is that different? Don't worry, we're going to get into it, right? As I said in the beginning of this live, guilt is transcended from shame, meaning it's a step above it, right? So it's a higher vibration, it's a higher frequency, and ultimately our goal is to continue transcending from one emotion, one feeling to another until we get to that place of peace, inner peace, where we can all breathe a sigh of relief and be completely happy and aligned with who we are. That's our ultimate goal, right? As I said, the interesting thing about guilt, and this can go for shame as well too, because our brains, and I keep telling you this, and I'm reiterating it for a reason, because it's an important concept for you to grasp, to be able to really gain as much out of these topics as you want to, and I would like you to, right? The brain does not know the difference between you thinking you're guilty about something and you actually being guilty about something. So if you have a situation where you have an immense amount of guilt, even if you didn't do anything, maybe you thought something ill about something else, about somebody else. Maybe you thought at some point like, oh, I wish that person would just like XYZ, you know, and we've all had those thoughts like, oh, I wish this person would just go out and something bad happen. Like, you know, we don't sometimes mean to have those thoughts. They just pop into our heads, especially if someone has wronged us or if we feel like somebody's hurt us. We have these feelings, and then we might feel guilty for having the feelings, even though we didn't do anything, even though we didn't actually have ill will happen to anybody. Just the thought of feeling guilty about having the thought is enough to put your body into the state of feeling the guilt, if that makes sense. So we have to be very mindful about the thoughts that we're thinking, because ultimately what we're thinking, whether it's true or it's not, whether it's real or it's not, intentional or unintentional, our body can't tell the difference. So we have to be really mindful in our thinking and in our thoughts, right? And the interesting thing, and as I said, I'm going to get to this a little bit sooner, here's the distinct difference between between shame and guilt, because guilt is actually much easier to move through. And I know that might not seem like the case. It might feel like you're carrying guilt around more than you're carrying around shame. But it's different because it's easier to manage. Guilt has a purpose. It has like a particular thing that you're trying to get over, right? Where you can make amends, where you can apologize, where you can sort through it. There's actually like a root to guilt. Whereas with shame, it's a bit different, because shame is this feeling about yourself being bad or yourself being wrong, or yourself being immoral. Whereas guilt is having feelings that you've done something bad, you've done something immoral, right? So there's a difference there. Whereas guilt's easier to let go of, it's easier to sort through, it's easier to manage. Shame is a bit difficult because it's about the self as opposed to something you've done externally or thought about another person. Hopefully you can see the difference there. Again, I'm going to get into it a little bit more, right? So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the types of guilt, because believe it or not, there are a couple different types, right? So the first type of guilt is like guilt pertaining to something that actually happened, meaning where you've done something that has caused harm to a person, maybe not necessarily bodily harm, but you've said something that's been hurtful, or something has happened and you have, whether it was unintentional or intentional, you've caused somebody else pain or you've caused somebody else harm. So that is the guilt about something that has actually happened, and it's typically about your own behavior. So maybe you've you've lied to somebody, or you've cheated, or you've stolen something, or you've been, relying on smoking or drinking or gambling or any of those things to get you through. You might have some guilt around your own behavior. And in this case, it actually makes sense, and it's natural for you to have guilt around those feelings. We're all going to feel guilt about some things at some point in our life. It's something naturally that happens to all human beings. In fact, we all have it in common. I mean, obviously there are certain people that are void of guilt, void of feeling shame, things like that. They're an entirely different case, but for most people, we all feel it naturally, and it's typically about something that has actually happened. So that's number one, guilt about something that has actually physically happened. So number two is guilt around wanting something or wishing something, but there's no action involved, meaning it hasn't actually happened. You've simply thought it, you desire it. And as I said earlier, simply the act of considering something that is outside of your moral boundaries can trigger feelings of guilt. So lusting over somebody, if you're already in a relationship, or thinking about cheating on a test. Right? We all have that in high school where we're like, oh man, what if I cheated on this algebra test? What could I write it on my arm? Could I make a little notepad? Could I put a note on the back of my calculator, or I write on my calculator? Even though you might not have done the thing, there's some guilt involved with oh man, how could I even think about cheating? That's not who I am. That's not who I am as a person. Those aren't my values. You might feel guilty for that reason, and this can result in you beating yourself up over even having the thought. If you're in a relationship and you find yourself lusting over somebody else, you can imagine how much guilt would come over you, but you haven't done anything. There hasn't been any action. It's just that mere thought that puts you into and triggers these feelings of guilt. And a lot of times when something like that comes up, our first instinct is to repress, is to push those things into the shadowy aspects of ourself. And if you're new here, you might not know I did a whole live on the shadow self and what that means. You can actually check it out. If you are in the group here, you can go to media, the Facebook group specifically, media videos, and there is one there all about the shadow self. You can check that one out if you're interested, right? But if you're repressing it, you're actually pushing it into your shadow aspect, and you're saying I don't like this side of me, so I reject it and I'm going to push it down. But ultimately, that's not really what's mentally healthiest for you. But we're going to talk about how to move through that when we get to the end of the live and we talk about some of the ways to manage and cope with guilt. Number three is feelings of guilt for perceived wrongdoing, meaning you subjectively feel as though you have done something wrong, and whether or not the other person thought you did something wrong, or they took offense to it, or they actually were hurt by it, that part doesn't matter. The other person doesn't matter. In this case, you perceived that you've done something wrong, and as we talked about earlier, our thoughts have the power to trigger the feelings of guilt even if we didn't do anything wrong, right? And a good example of this is if you ever jinxed someone, or been oh, I wish them I hope they get all the bad luck in the world, right? It's you thought that, and then what if that person has a bout of bad luck, or a bunch of negative things start happening to them? You are then perceiving that you are the reason. You're oh my God, I jinxed them, now everything's going wrong in their life. So that is perceived wrongdoing, meaning you think you've done it, but you actually haven't done anything at all. You just are feeling triggered or activated. Your guilt is activated because you feel as though you've done something wrong, when in reality, it's just your perception, right? And sometimes too, and here's what's interesting about the brain, because if something happens, if there's a set of circumstances, especially when you're younger and you've perceived that you've done something wrong, your brain remembers details of the circumstance, how you programmed them. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later. So you tell yourself a story, you tell yourself this reason why you have all this, why all this circumstance is your fault, why you should feel guilty about it. And whether or not the other person thinks the way that you're thinking about yourself is kind of irrelevant in this case, because your guilt is triggered because of the story you've been telling yourself, and you've been telling yourself the I'm guilty story for so long that it's now become automatic and habitual. So that is one of those things that we have to be aware of, because the mind is really finicky. And that's why I'm always telling you that it's really important to be mindful of the thoughts, because if that story gets programmed, the I'm guilty story, it will continue to play over and over and over again. And the other person is probably I don't even know what you're talking about, Denise. I don't even remember that. So we have to be really mindful of that. Number four is guilt around feeling as though you didn't step in enough. And again, this is that should have, would have, could have. If only I had been there, I could have saved him or her. If only I had noticed X, Y, and Z sooner, I could have made a difference. So guilt pertaining to like, I could have done this. I could have saved this person. I could have, and this could be particularly relevant if you're in a case where, let's say, one of your loved ones is struggling with drug use, and, something happens, or they have something happen to them. Perhaps it's tragic in nature, something like that. You might feel guilty because you're like, man, if I would have just forced them to do this, or if I would have forced them to stop, or what if I would have stepped in more? Maybe if I had done those things, I could have saved them. I could have done something for them. But that's not always the case, right? So this is feeling guilty when you wanted to step in or you feel like you didn't do enough. Number 5 is survivor guilt, or guilt for achieving or feeling as though you have success. And this happens a lot, I think, as I was reading and researching for this, the different types of guilt and having a really good understanding about it. A lot of times when soldiers go to war, the ones that come back have survivor guilt because their friends weren't as lucky. So they're feeling all of this remorse and all of this guilt because, man, I survived and they didn't. This is a really complex one because and the same as if you're having a lot of success and your friend is going through a hard time, you start to feel guilty about your own success. So that's the 5th type of guilt, the guilt of survivor or success guilt. And that's a little bit tricky, but we're going to tell you how many of us are here. Me, myself, and I are going to show you some ways to get out of that. But let's, before we move on to that, let's talk about the psychology of guilt, because I think this is very interesting to be able to understand, right? So guilt is conditioned or learned. That is first and foremost, right off the hop, meaning it comes from, and it's taught to you by family, by friends, by community, by religion, by society, whatever it is. We don't have an understanding of guilt until we learn this from other people. So it becomes ingrained in who you are. It is taught to you during your formidable years, during your youthful years. This is where you learn and pick up guilt. So that's the first thing you need to know. It's a learned behavior. And if it's a learned behavior, that means it can be unlearned or unprogrammed, which is what I'm all about here. Take reverse programming all of these things we picked up from childhood, right? So, and if we think about it, think about your parents when you're younger telling you how disappointed they were in you. I'm so disappointed, Denise, that you didn't get an A. I'm so disappointed that you broke curfew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even today, now think about when you hear somebody say, oh, I'm angry with you versus I'm disappointed in you. Disappointment is always going to feel worse because we as human beings want to be approved. That's what we seek. We want approval. And when we're young, we want approval from our parents so desperately that we're willing to do whatever it takes to gain that approval. And when we don't, and they say they're disappointed in us, that triggers the guilt. So as we grow into adulthood, we're always seeking for that approval constantly, right? So, and that's why when someone says they're disappointed in you, it hurts, or it's more activating than if someone's just full blown mad at you. It's like we can deal with it. I can deal with it if you're mad at me, but I can't deal with it if you're going to be disappointed, right? And as I said, as a child, you're really wanting to seek and gain approval and acceptance, and that's where the guilt comes in. So this need for approval is so ingrained. It comes with us into adulthood. Like, come along with us. It's adulthood now. Let's, and we want to impress others constantly. We're constantly in this need to like impress other people so that we can feel better about ourselves. And then if somebody disapproves or looks down on what you've done or said, your guilt is automatically triggered because that sense of approval is no longer there. It's being taken away from you, right? So then that inner wounded child is coming out that's like, oh man, my mommy and daddy are disappointed in me. And that's where that guilt comes from. And let's remember when we're talking about the psychology of guilt, that guilt can actually motivate us to change our behavior because it's a trigger for us to begin avoiding pain and discomfort. And if we all know that our brain wants nothing more than to protect us, keep us safe. So we know that our brain wants to protect us, and guilt is a way to notify us or let us know, hey, there's something going on in here and we need to kind of address it and get to the root of the problem and figure out why we're feeling this guilt. Is it something that we need to change about ourselves, or is it something in our thoughts that we need to reprogram? This is actually probably going to be a shorter live than normal. I'm really impressed because we're already in the coping with guilt in a healthy way part of this. I tried to actually kind of condense it today because I know these can go on a little long, and who has a half an hour to listen to me all the time? No, I'm kidding. Anyway, so let's talk about how we can deal with some of these feelings of guilt. The first thing is reframing, and I go on and on about reframing because I truly feel as though just shifting our perspective and the way we're seeing things and looking at them in a new light can really serve as a way to change our pattern of thinking and to look at it in a new way. And it's my most well used method, and it's something I'm always teaching my clients, and I'm always teaching our community from one live to another. If I'm working one-on-one in whatever capacity, I'm always using reframed. So reframing. So if you are, for example, feeling guilty about a particular set of circumstances, I want you to take a moment and look at the situation from a different perspective. Remember, what happens with guilt is we continue to tell ourselves the same guilt story over and over and over again, that it becomes rooted and automatic in our brain and in our thoughts. So if that's the case and it becomes really, really subjective, it's important for us to take ourselves out of the picture and look at it in a more objective fashion so that we can look at it from all angles, because our lens is going to alter the actual set of circumstances. So if we can do that, if we can look at it from different perspectives and understand how other people might have perceived it and reframe the situation, it will allow us to untether ourselves from feeling that guilt, right? And sometimes in this particular situation, you can ask yourself, what could I have done differently? How, and especially in a period of reflection as you're an adult, and if you have something that you're hanging on to from childhood, you can look at it like, how would adult Denise do this differently? What actions could I have done to cause a different outcome? What could I have done differently if I was in that same situation now? And asking some of those questions and how you might deal with it today can really support you in moving through some of that guilt. Number 2 is self-forgiveness. And guys, I know this is hard. I know forgiveness of other people is hard, and forgiving the self is even harder. But it's easy to get trapped in the feelings of guilt, always looking back, always wishing you had made different choices. And so the practice rather of self-forgiveness doesn't necessarily, let me put this out there, doesn't necessarily mean that you're off the hook. If you've done something to hurt somebody and that person is still harboring feelings of hurt, it doesn't let you off the hook for it. But what it does is allow you to find solutions, how to make amends. What can I do to change the situation? And you come to terms and take responsibility for what's happened. Because sometimes too, you might get defensive and blame it on other things, or it was this, or it was that, or I'm a victim, and all these things, instead of taking responsibility for the harm that you caused. It's always, and I say this all the time, you can't help how you made somebody else feel. If somebody else said that you hurt them and they're hurt by it, feeling guilty doesn't do anything about it. Taking responsibility for it, forgiving yourself for making those choices, and doing what you can to rectify the situation, that's actually going to help alleviate some of that guilt. Number 3, finding the learning opportunity. If you've been around here for a while, I'm a big believer that every single set of circumstances that we go through are meant for us, and there is a learning opportunity that is meant to be had. It is meant to catapult us, to expand us, and to move us into another state of development, right? So what is the lesson? Don't let it be in vain. Allow yourself to use it to improve. Did you make the best choice possible in that moment? Maybe, maybe not, but what did you learn, right? If it wasn't the best case scenario, how can you take that information and ensure that it never happens again? So you're transmuting the feeling of guilt into something more resourceful and using it to ensure that you are a better person moving forward. And ask yourself, what led to this mistake I've made? What did your actions tell you about you? Is there some internal work that you need to do? Is there some things that you need to explore within you? But take the learning opportunity. Every single solitary set of circumstances leads to an opportunity to learn and to grow. And treat every single experience, whether positive or negative, as an opportunity. And it will really help support you just in life in general, not only with regards to guilt, but completely. Number 4, acknowledge and accept. I don't know why I'm talking this way. If the origin of the guilt is based on desire or guilty thoughts, Allow them to be there. Acknowledge them and to admit to yourself that they are there. So if you have lusted about another individual, if you've thought about cheating on a test, if you've had those guilty, or if you've had those thoughts and you're feeling guilty about them, don't push them down. Don't repress them. Don't put them into your shadowy side. Accept them. Say, okay, this is something I'm thinking. I accept it. And, don't hide from it, because we want to ensure our well-being is protected at all times. And you're better off acknowledging some of these things, accepting them, and taking the power back than just harboring some guilty emotions about them and pushing them into the shadow. It's a much better way to release the guilt. Number 5, assessing the situation. Ask yourself, and this goes back to perceived guilt. So ask yourself, did I actually do something wrong, or am I just perceiving it to be true? And remember, the memory can be fickle, in that you will remember whatever story you have recorded and committed to memory. And if this is an automatic thought and an automatic story, you want to do some self-reflection and actually determine if you have done something wrong, or it's your thoughts that are making you feel guilty about something. Number 6 is self-care. And this is particularly important if you are having guilt around I shoulda, woulda, coulda, or if you're feeling guilty about, let's say you're trying to support someone, you're helping someone, they're ill, and you're feeling guilty that you aren't doing enough, and then you're feeling even more guilty because you have to take a few moments for yourself and you have to do some self-care because you're coming to this point where you're filled with compassion fatigue. Self-care is key when it comes to managing guilt, because you need to tend to your own heart, your own soul, to be able to help other people, to be able to move through it. You have to tend to yourself. So if you are feeling guilty about putting yourself first, and I know a lot of us here have that, give yourself permission to release those thoughts and know that self-care is key, and it is nothing to feel guilty about. Hi, Angie. Angie just arrived. I'm waving at you. So number 7, replace negative thoughts with compassion. If you have in fact done something to feel guilty about, if you've actually done something to cause harm or hurt to another person, I want you to know it doesn't make you a bad person. The fact that you can feel guilt means that you feel remorse, means that you are not a terrible person. You have done something that hurt another person, but that doesn't make you inherently bad. Okay, so I want you to take that thought of I'm a bad person, I hurt this person, and again, go back to learning about it. What have you learned, right? It's easier to beat yourself up than to deal with it, than to say, okay, I've done something wrong. What have I learned? How can I move forward, right? Be kind to yourself. Just because you've made a decision in the past doesn't mean that you're going to continue to make the same decision. As long as you're conscious of the decision you've made and you work to make amends, you work to make things right, you work to make sure you never make the same mistakes again, find the positive. Always find the positive. And think about what you might say to your friend in the same situation. If she was sharing with you or he was sharing with you, I did XYZ and it hurt this person, you're not going to be like, oh, you're a bad person, you're a terrible individual. No, you're going to be like, you did whatever you could with the information you had in that moment. You made the very best decisions you could. And remind yourself of your strengths. What makes you a good person? That will help you to release the guilt. And finally, number 8, allow the guilt to serve as a reminder. Guilt can be used as a tool. It can be used as an indicator that you're making choices that are outside of your moral boundaries. And feeling guilty in and of itself could be a sign that you're in violation of your own rules of engagement. And it's a sign that you have some self-reflection to do. You have some work that you need to do within, because you need to ask yourself, why am I making these decisions? Why am I violating my own boundaries? So for example, this is a great one. If you're feeling guilty because you haven't seen your family in a little while, you have, maybe you've had a lot going on and you feel like it's been too long, and what are they going to say if I reach out to them? And, you're having those feelings of guilt about it. Give them a call, reconnect. Even if you feel like they wouldn't be responsive, use it as a sign that you should reach out. And of course, number 9, support. If you are really having a difficult time moving through guilt, moving through those feelings, releasing yourself from them, transcending them to the next set of emotions, moving on. If you're stuck in this low vibrational, energetic output, seek out support, whether it's a friend, a counselor, a psychotherapist, a coach, whatever it is. Find somebody that can help you move through it, because you don't have to go out at it alone. You are never alone. And if you have questions about how I might be able to help you transcend that guilt, please reach out to me. Send me a message, send me a DM, put a comment below, email me, whatever it is you need. I would love to support you in whatever way I can. And with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our second installment of going through emotions and their energetic output and frequency. Next week, we will have another one. If there's something else that you would like to see, let me know and we can take a break from this as well. Again, I'm here to serve you. But I hope that all of you have a really amazing day. I hope you have a really amazing weekend, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.